Pilots, what's the dumbest complaint a passenger filed mid-flight? I'm a commercial pilot. I've been flying for 23 years. I've seen everything. The dumbest complaint I've ever received was from a man in first class on a flight from Dallas to Honolulu in 2019. The passenger's name was Reginald Whitmarsh. He was 48 years old. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than my car. He'd boarded the plane like he'd been doing the airline a favor by flying with us. About an hour into the flight, the lead flight attendant Persephone came up to the cockpit. She'd looked frustrated. She told me a passenger wanted to speak directly to the pilot. She'd told me he was refusing to take no for an answer. I'd asked her what the complaint was. She'd said, "He's complaining that the engines are too loud." I'd stared at her. "He's on a Boeing 757. The engines are doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. He's saying they're louder than he expected. He's saying it's affecting his ability to make business calls. He wants the engines turned down." I'd laughed. "Persephone, there's no engine volume control. He's threatening to file a formal complaint with the FAA. He's saying he's friends with someone on the board. I'll come back and talk to him." I'd left my first officer in the cockpit. I'd walked back to first class. Reginald had been sitting in seat 2A with his laptop open. He'd been wearing noise-canceling headphones over his ears, even though they'd been turned off. I'd introduced myself. I'd asked him about his complaint. He'd taken off his headphones with a sigh. He'd said, "Captain, I appreciate you coming back. I need you to do something about the engine noise. I have a board meeting at 2 p.m. via satellite phone, and I cannot make calls with this level of noise." "Sir, I understand the noise is loud. Unfortunately, the engines need to run at this level to maintain our altitude and speed." "Captain, I'm sure there's something you can do. Throttle back, quieter setting, something." "Sir, if I throttle back, we'll lose altitude. We're at 36,000 feet. We need this much power. Then climb higher. Get above the noise." I'd stared at him for a long moment. In my 23 years of flying, I'd never had a passenger ask me to climb above the noise of my own engines. He'd been completely serious. I'd been polite. I'd said, "Sir, I'm sorry, but the engines aren't something we can adjust for noise. I'd recommend trying your headphones with the noise cancellation on, or moving to a quieter section of the plane. There's no quieter section in first class." "Sir, the engines are at the back of the plane. The closer to the front, the quieter. First class is already the quietest section." Reginald had looked at me like I'd insulted him. He'd said, "Captain, I'm filing a complaint. This is unacceptable customer service." "Sir, you're welcome to file whatever complaints you'd like." I'd walked back to the cockpit. I told my first officer Octavia what had happened. We'd both laughed. We'd been laughing for about 30 seconds when the cockpit phone had rung. It had been Persephone. She'd said, "Captain, we have a new situation. Mr. Whitmarsh just had a medical event. He'd been getting up to go to the bathroom. He fell. We need a medical assist." Mr. Whitmarsh had fallen and broken his wrist. He'd hit his head on the way down. He'd been bleeding from a cut on his forehead. Persephone had been wonderful. She'd been calm. She'd been doing everything right while Mr. Whitmarsh had been swearing at her. He'd been blaming her for creating an unsafe environment. He'd been blaming the airline for not warning him about the dangers of standing up. He'd told her he was going to sue. We'd had a passenger who'd been a doctor. He'd been in 4A. He'd come up to first class to help. His name was Dr. Augustin Lockhart. He'd been a trauma surgeon at a major hospital in Honolulu. He'd assessed Mr. Whitmarsh. He'd told us Mr. Whitmarsh had a likely concussion and a broken wrist. He'd offered to do it. Mr. Whitmarsh had refused to let Dr. Lockhart treat him. Mr. Whitmarsh had told Dr. Lockhart that Dr. Lockhart wasn't qualified without seeing credentials. Dr. Lockhart had stepped back. We'd diverted to San Francisco for emergency medical landing. We'd been 4 hours into the flight. The diversion had cost the airline approximately $95,000. The thing nobody had known until later was that Mr. Whitmarsh had been planning to file a lawsuit against the airline since before he'd even boarded the plane. He'd been targeting our airline specifically. He'd been a former competitor of our parent company's CEO. He'd been laying groundwork for a hostile takeover. He'd been planning to use any incident to file a complaint that would generate media attention. The engine noise complaint had been step 1 of a multi-step plan. The fall had been step 2. The refusing medical treatment had been step 3. He'd been going to sue for negligence and improper response to a medical emergency. The thing is, we'd had cameras in first class. We'd had a recording of him interacting with me. We'd had a recording of him falling because he hadn't held the handrail he'd been told to use. We'd had a recording of him refusing medical treatment from a trauma surgeon. The recordings had been given to our legal team. Mr. Whitmarsh's lawsuit had been thrown out within 4 weeks. The judge had ruled it frivolous. He'd been ordered to pay the airline's legal fees, about $48,000. He'd been blacklisted by every major carrier. He could no longer fly first class on any airline in North America. The hostile takeover had failed. Mr. Whitmarsh had been forced out of his own company by his board within 18 months. He'd lost approximately $300 million. The thing nobody at the airline knew until last year is that I'd been quietly contacted by a former colleague of Mr. Whitmarsh's. He'd told me Mr. Whitmarsh had been planning something specific against the airline. He'd told me there had been a larger plan involving people at the airline. He told me 3 of our former pilots had been receiving money from Mr. Whitmarsh's company for years before this incident. One of them had been my old captain. The man who contacted me was named Fergus Albright. He'd worked with Reginald for years before leaving the company. I called Fergus back that same night. He picked up, but he was careful. He didn't want to say much on the phone. I asked him if we could meet. He said, "There's a diner about 10 minutes from the airport. I can be there in an hour." I walked into the diner, and Fergus was already sitting in a booth near the back. He didn't shake my hand. He just nodded at the seat across from him. Before I could even say anything, he reached into a bag next to him and slid a folder across the table. I opened it. Inside were bank records, printouts of wire transfers, monthly payments going from a shell company to 3 different accounts. The shell company was tied to Reginald's holding group. The amounts were small, $4,000 to $6,000 a month. Fergus said, "Whitmarsh called it an aviation advisory board. He told them they were consulting on private jet acquisitions, but none of them ever consulted on anything. They just answered questions." I looked back down at the records. I started scanning the names on the accounts. The first 2 were pilots I barely knew. Both retired. Then I saw the third name, Dylan Fournier. I read it again. My old captain. The man who had trained me during my first year as a first officer. The man who had taught me how to handle crosswinds, how to read weather, how to talk to passengers. The man who had written my recommendation letter when I applied for captain. His name was right there on a bank record, taking money from Reginald Whitmarsh's company. Something cracked in my chest. I asked Fergus what kind of of questions Reginald had been asking these pilots. Fergus said, maintenance schedules, crew rotation patterns, which routes had the oldest aircraft, which captains were new, which flights were most likely to have mechanical delays. I sat back. My brain started connecting things. Reginald hadn't just been some rich guy filing random complaints on random flights. He had been choosing specific flights. I remembered something. The Dallas to Honolulu route, the one where the whole engine noise thing happened. That aircraft had been flagged for a minor hydraulic sensor issue about 2 weeks before the flight. The issue had been fixed, but the flag had been in the maintenance system. If someone had told Reginald about that flag, he would have known. He would have known that any complaint filed on that specific route would stack right on top of an existing maintenance record. It would make us look negligent in court even though everything had been properly repaired. The engine noise complaint was never about engine noise. It was a calculated move on a flight that had been selected because of its maintenance history. I looked at Fergus and asked him why he was coming forward now. This had all happened years ago. Fergus paused. He looked down at the table. Then he said, because Whitmarsh is trying again. He lost his company. He lost his money, but he still has the pilots, and one of them is still active. My whole body went tight. Dylan, he had retired 2 years ago, but retired didn't mean gone. Dylan still had his credentials. He still had friends inside the airline. He still had access to the pilot forums where crew schedules and route changes got discussed. I thanked Fergus. I drove home. I sat in my car in the driveway for about 20 minutes. Dylan had trained me. Dylan had been like a second father to me in the cockpit, and now I was looking at bank records that said he'd been selling information to a man who tried to destroy the airline we both worked for. I pulled out my phone and called Persephone. She picked up on the second ring. I told her everything. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Dylan, are you sure? I told her I was sure. She said, what are you going to do? I didn't even have to think about it. I said, I'm going to find out what Dylan gave him, and I'm going to find out what Reginald is planning next. I started pulling at the thread the next day. I reached out to one of the 2 retired pilots on Fergus's list through an old colleague I trusted. I got the guy's number and called him. The second I said Reginald Whitmarsh's name, the line went dead. I tried the second retired pilot, same thing. 2 sentences in, click, gone. Neither of them would talk. The speed of it, the way they both shut down the exact same way, told me Reginald still had some kind of hold on these guys. So I decided to go straight to the source. I called Dylan. I kept it light. Hey, it's been a while. Want to grab coffee this week? Dylan sounded great on the phone. Warm, friendly. We met at a coffee shop near the airport 2 days later. Dylan looked the same as I remembered. A little grayer, the same easy smile, the same way of leaning back in his chair like nothing in the world bothered him. We talked about normal stuff for a while. His golf game, my schedule. It felt like sitting with the guy who'd taught me everything, and that made what I was about to do feel even worse. I steered the conversation toward old flights, funny stories. Then I brought up the Reginald Whitmarsh incident. I said, hey, you remember that guy who complained about engine noise on the Honolulu route? Dylan laughed. He shook his head and said, that guy was a clown. I watched his face. He was relaxed. Either he was completely innocent or he was one of the best liars I'd ever met. I should have stopped there. I made a mistake. I pushed too hard. I said, yeah, funny thing actually. Someone told me recently that Whitmarsh had been paying pilots, like actual payments, for information. The second I said it, Dylan's face changed. It was fast, maybe half a second. His smile stayed, but something behind it shifted. His jaw tightened just a little. Then he laughed again and said, paying pilots? For what? That's insane. But the laugh was different this time. It was louder than it needed to be, and his eyes didn't match it anymore. They were watching me now, measuring me. I knew right then that I'd messed up. Dylan knew. He knew someone was talking. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Jillian. Jillian was a retired senior captain who'd been my mentor years ago, long before Dylan even. She said, I need to talk to you about something. Dylan called me yesterday. He wanted to know if anyone from the old crew had been reaching out to you. He sounded nervous. I told her the short version, the bank records, the shell company, Dylan's role. When I finished, she said, if Dylan is cleaning house, you need to move fast. He's smart. He'll cover his tracks. The first thing I did was try to warn Fergus. I called his number. It rang and went to voicemail. I called again the next morning. Same thing. I drove to the diner where we'd met. The owner thought about it for a second, then shook his head. He said, haven't seen him in a while. I sat in my car outside the diner for a long time. The walls were closing in. I was sitting at home that evening going through the bank records again when my phone buzzed. It was Octavia. She was still my first officer. She said, something weird happened today. Dylan showed up at the crew lounge. He's been retired for 2 years. He spent 40 minutes talking to the operations manager. I thought you should know. I thanked her. Dylan wasn't just covering his tracks. Dylan was still active. He was still inside the building, still plugged into the system like he'd never left. I called Persephone and Octavia. I told them both what was happening. Persephone said, come over tonight, both of you. Let's sit down and figure this out. That evening, I drove to Persephone's place. We sat around her kitchen table with the folder spread out between us. Persephone looked at the papers for a long time. Then she looked up at me and said, you've got the bank records, you've got the dates, you've got the maintenance flag from the 2019 flight. Can't you put the timeline together yourself? I hadn't thought about it that way. I'd been so focused on getting Fergus to back me up that I hadn't considered building the case from the inside. Octavia opened her laptop. She still had access to crew scheduling records. She started pulling up flight record, dates, routes, aircraft assignments, maintenance notes. I read off the dates of the wire transfers. Octavia cross-referenced them with the flight logs. And that's when the picture started to form. Every flight where Reginald or one of his associates had booked a ticket lined up with a flight that had a recent maintenance note in the system. Every single one. A hydraulic sensor flag here, a brake inspection note there. All of them resolved. All of them cleared. But all of them sitting in the maintenance history like little red marks that would look bad in a courtroom. Octavia leaned back. She said, this isn't coincidence. Someone was telling him which flights to book. We weren't stuck anymore. We were building something. Persephone went quiet for a while, scrolling through something on her phone. Then she stood up and went to a cabinet in the hallway. She came back with a binder, her personal copies of cabin crew reports. She was meticulous like that. She flipped to the 2019 flight. She ran her finger down her own handwritten notes from that day. Then she stopped. She looked up at me. She said, I wrote this down that day and I completely forgot about it. Before the engine noise complaint, before any of it, Reginald asked me 3 questions while I was doing the welcome service in first class. He asked me which aircraft type we were flying. He asked me when the last maintenance maintenance check had been, and he asked me whether the captain was new to the route. She put the binder down on the table. She said he was confirming information someone had already given him. The room was quiet for a second. Reginald hadn't just shown up on that flight hoping for something to complain about. He'd known what plane we were on. He'd known about the maintenance history. He'd known I was an experienced captain, not a new one. Someone had given him a full briefing before he ever stepped on that aircraft. For the first time in days, I felt like we had enough. I was about to say we should put it all together into a formal document when my phone rang. It was Dylan. My chest got tight. I picked up. His voice was calm, steady, almost friendly. He said, "I know what you're doing, and I want you to know something. I've already spoken to the airline's legal team. I told them you've been harassing a retired colleague and spreading defamatory accusations. I told them you've been accessing crew records without authorization through your first officer. They're opening an internal investigation against you." The line went dead. I looked at Octavia, then at Persephone. Everything had just flipped. 5 minutes ago, I was building a case against Dylan. Now Dylan had built a case against me. The worst part was, some of what Dylan told them was technically true. I'd been reaching out to a retired colleague. Octavia had been pulling scheduling records. If you looked at it from the outside, it could absolutely look like harassment and unauthorized access. Dylan had done exactly what Jillian warned me he would do. He'd moved fast. He'd covered himself. I had 72 hours before the internal investigation formally started. I knew that because Jillian called me the next morning. She'd been up all night thinking about it. She said, "Listen to me. Dylan made a mistake calling legal. He put himself on record. If you can get the bank records in front of the right person before the investigation shuts you out, Dylan's own complaint becomes evidence that he was trying to suppress the truth." She was right. Dylan had tried to get ahead of me, but in doing so, he'd created a paper trail of his own. Jillian told me she knew someone inside the airline's corporate oversight division. Not legal. Compliance. A woman she'd known for 15 years. She said, "Go through compliance, not legal. Legal is where Dylan went. Compliance is independent." So that's what I did. I walked into the compliance office the next morning carrying everything. The bank records from Fergus, the flight timeline Octavia had built, Persephone's cabin crew report, and a written statement I'd stayed up until 2 in the morning putting together. The compliance officer brought me into a small conference room. I laid everything out. She listened for 45 minutes without saying a single word. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Why didn't you come to us first?" I said, "Because I didn't have enough until 2 days ago, and now I'm being investigated for trying to find the truth." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Go home. Don't contact Dylan again. We'll handle this from here." So I went home, and I waited. 3 weeks passed. The internal investigation against me was quietly suspended after the first week. By the end of the third week, it was dropped entirely. Then the compliance officer called me and asked me to come in. When I got there, she told me the airline's forensic auditors had traced the shell company payments. They'd confirmed monthly transfers to all 3 pilots spanning 4 years. She told me Dylan's bank records showed he'd received over $280,000 total. She told me the 2 retired pilots had cooperated the moment they were confronted with the evidence. They'd broken right away and admitted everything. Then she told me the part that hit the hardest. Dylan hadn't just shared crew schedules and maintenance records. Dylan had specifically recommended my flight for Reginald's 2019 scheme. Dylan had told Reginald that I was a by-the-book captain, that I would handle the complaint exactly the way I did, politely and professionally, which would make the airline's response look dismissive and cold in a courtroom. Dylan had used my integrity against me. I had been chosen on purpose. I sat in that compliance officer's chair and I didn't say anything for a long time. The man who taught me how to fly had handpicked me to be the fall guy because he knew I'd do my job right. Jillian told me what happened next because I wasn't there for it. Dylan was brought in for a formal interview. He tried to turn it around one last time. He told them I had known about the payments. He said I was trying to cover my own involvement, but the compliance team had every bank record. My name wasn't on a single one of them. Dylan's was. His credentials were revoked. The airline filed a civil suit against him. Reginald, already stripped of his company and blacklisted from flying, was referred to federal investigators for the broader scheme. And Fergus, he came back. Weeks later, he called me out of nowhere. His voice sounded lighter than I'd ever heard it. He said, "I'm sorry I went quiet. I was scared, but I'm glad you didn't stop." I went back to flying. My next rotation was with Octavia. We settled into the cockpit before a flight to Honolulu, the same route, and she looked over at me with a small smile and said, "Think anyone's going to complain about engine noise today?" I laughed, but it was a different laugh than before. Quieter. I thought about Dylan, who taught me how to fly, who wrote the letter that got me this job, who picked me specifically because he knew I would be professional. I'd been betrayed by someone I trusted completely, and I'd been the one to bring it into the light. Persephone stopped by the cockpit before boarding started. She looked at me and said, "Smooth skies, Captain." I nodded. The engines started. They were loud. They were supposed to be.